Back to the Future began with a deceptively simple question. What would happen if you could travel back in time and meet your parents when they were teenagers? The question sounds like the beginning of a science fiction story, but the idea that eventually became Back to the Future was actually rooted in something much more personal and much more ordinary. It came from a filmmaker wondering about his own family, his own parents, and the strange difficulty of imagining them as young people. The two people responsible for turning that idea into a movie were screenwriter Bob Gale and director Robert Zemeckis. The two had met while studying at the University of Southern California School of Cinema, and they became long-term creative partners. Their professional relationship had already produced several projects, including I Want to Hold Your Hand and Used Cars. They were fascinated by popular culture, comedy, teenagers, nostalgia, and the possibility of using ordinary people and situations as the foundation for extraordinary stories. The initial idea for Back to the Future emerged in 1980. At that point, neither Gale nor Zemeckis had the finished story in their heads. They knew they wanted to make a time travel movie, but the basic concept was still undeveloped. They were looking for a way to make time travel entertaining without turning the movie into a complicated history lesson. The personal spark came when Bob Gale was visiting his parents and looking through an old high school yearbook belonging to his father. Gale began thinking about his father as a teenager. He wondered whether he would have liked his father if they had been the same age and attended the same school. More importantly, he realized that there was no way for him to know the answer. His father existed in his mind primarily as his father, not as a young man with friends, insecurities, ambitions, romantic interests, and a completely separate teenage identity. That thought became the emotional foundation of the entire movie. The concept was powerful because it immediately created both comedy and dramatic potential. A teenager could travel back in time and discover that his parents were not simply older versions of the people he knew. They were different people. They had been teenagers with their own personalities and problems. The son might even discover things about his parents that were completely unexpected. Robert Zemeckis had a related experience with his own family. His mother had told stories about her childhood, but some of those stories seemed to contradict one another. That helped reinforce the idea that parents are unreliable witnesses when describing their younger years. Adults tend to remember their childhood selectively, sometimes turning ordinary experiences into heroic stories. The filmmakers realized that a time machine could provide the ultimate way of checking whether those stories were true. This gave Back to the Future something that many time travel stories did not have. The time travel mechanism was not supposed to be the entire point of the movie. It was a device that allowed the filmmakers to explore family, adolescence, identity, and the gap between how people remember the past and how the past actually happened. The earliest version of the concept was therefore much more character-driven than it might initially appear. The filmmakers were not primarily asking, what is the most spectacular thing we can do with a time machine? They were asking, what is the most interesting person we could send back in time? The answer was a teenager. That decision was crucial because teenagers already occupy an unusual position between childhood and adulthood. Marty McFly is old enough to have his own opinions and ambitions, but young enough to still be dependent on his parents. He has an established identity, yet he has not completely decided who he will become. Sending someone like Marty into the past, therefore, creates a natural story about identity. When Marty meets his parents in 1955, he is not simply observing history. He is seeing the people responsible for his existence before they became the people he knows. Even more dramatically, he accidentally interferes with their relationship. This means that Marty has to repair the relationship between his parents in order to guarantee his own future. That central idea was present very early in the development process, but the screenplay did not immediately become the version audiences eventually saw. Gale and Zemeckis began working on the screenplay in the fall of 1980. They approached the story through extensive experimentation. According to the filmmakers, they would work through scenes together, acting out situations and trying to determine what was funny, what was dramatically effective, and what made sense within the story's time travel rules. One of the biggest challenges was determining what the time machine should actually be. The final movie famously uses a DeLorean automobile, but that was not the original concept. In one early version of the screenplay, the time machine was a refrigerator. The idea was that the character would have to enter the refrigerator and activate it in order to travel through time. It was an imaginative idea, but it created an obvious practical and social problem. The filmmakers worried that children might imitate the movie and lock themselves inside refrigerators. As a result, the refrigerator concept was abandoned. This illustrates something important about the development of Back to the Future. The finished movie often feels as though every element was inevitable, but many of its most recognizable features were actually the result of experimentation and revision. The time machine went through different forms before becoming the DeLorean. The final choice was particularly effective because the car could function simultaneously as a machine, a visual icon, and a source of comedy. The filmmakers eventually established the idea that the machine required a very specific amount of speed and electrical energy to travel through time. This created a useful narrative principle. Time travel could not happen whenever the characters wanted. They needed the right conditions. Robert Zemeckis approached Back to the Future with a very specific filmmaking philosophy. Although the movie contains time travel, science fiction technology, action sequences, visual effects, romance, comedy, and elements of fantasy, Zemeckis did not want the audience to experience it primarily as a science fiction movie. His goal was to make the extraordinary feel ordinary, and then use that ordinary world to create extraordinary situations. This approach is one of the main reasons Back to the Future remains so accessible. The movie introduces an impossible machine, a scientist who has discovered how to travel through time, a teenager who accidentally changes his own family history, and a race against a lightning strike. Yet the audience never feels overwhelmed by the mechanics of the premise. Instead, the story remains focused on people. Zemeckis understood that the success of a time travel film depends less on whether the audience believes every scientific explanation and more on whether the audience believes the characters. Marty has to feel like a real teenager. Doc Brown has to feel like a real eccentric inventor. George has to feel like a believable, insecure teenager. Lorraine has to feel like a believable young woman discovering attraction. Biff has to feel like a recognizable bully. Once those characters feel real, the impossible events surrounding them become easier to accept. This was central to Zemeckis' artistic vision. Robert Zemeckis had developed a reputation for combining comedy with ambitious filmmaking techniques. He was interested in movies that could be entertaining on the surface while also being carefully constructed underneath. He frequently used visual details, physical comedy, editing, camera movement, and timing to create stories in which seemingly unrelated events eventually connect. Back to the Future is one of the clearest examples of this philosophy. Almost everything in the movie has a purpose. Objects introduced early often become important later. Jokes frequently become plot points. Background details establish information that becomes meaningful later. Characters' behavior in one period of time affects what we see in another period. The movie is therefore constructed almost like a machine. That quality is particularly appropriate because one of its central characters is a scientist obsessed with machines. Zemeckis' filmmaking style mirrors Doc Brown's personality. The movie is energetic, precise, curious, and fascinated by cause and effect. The director also understood the importance of momentum. Back to the Future rarely stops moving for very long. Even when characters are talking, the conversation usually establishes a problem, delivers information, creates a joke, or sets up a future event. This creates the sensation that the story is constantly accelerating. That sense of movement is not accidental. Zemeckis wanted the movie to feel like a roller coaster. The audience should understand what is happening, but they should also feel that the story is moving faster and faster toward a major payoff. This becomes especially important during the final sequence involving the clock tower and the lightning strike. The sequence works because the movie has spent most of its running time establishing pieces that eventually have to work together. The clock tower matters. The lightning matters. The DeLorean matters. The time circuits matter. Doc's calculations matter. Marty's arrival time matters. The cable matters. The store matters. And the exact moment of the lightning strike matters. Zemeckis brings all of those elements together so that the climax feels both surprising and inevitable. That is one of the defining characteristics of his style. He likes complicated situations that can eventually be resolved through precise visual storytelling. Rather than explaining everything verbally, he often allows the audience to see the solution developing. This is why the climax remains understandable, even though it contains several technical elements. We can see the cable. We can see the clock. We can see the DeLorean. We can see the lightning. We can see Marty driving. We understand the objective. The director trusts the audience to connect those elements. Zemeckis' background also helps explain his interest in mixing genres. His early career involved collaboration with Bob Gale, and together they developed a particular type of fast-moving American comedy. Their work was influenced by filmmakers who understood popular entertainment as a combination of strong characters, memorable situations, and precise pacing. Zemeckis was also heavily influenced by Steven Spielberg. Spielberg's influence can be seen in the movie's sense of wonder, family focus, youthful protagonist, adventurous tone, and ability to move between humor and suspense. But Back to the Future is not simply a Spielberg-style movie. Zemeckis brought his own interest in visual construction and comedic timing. Where Spielberg often emphasizes emotional wonder and suspense, Zemeckis frequently emphasizes mechanics. You want to know how the scene works. Where does the character stand? What object is nearby? What information does the audience already have? What information can be revealed now? What joke can be created from a situation? What visual detail can become important later? These questions shape the movie. One of Zemeckis' most important decisions was to make Marty the emotional center rather than Doc Brown. This is interesting because Doc is arguably the most extraordinary character. Doc invents the time machine. Doc understands the science. Doc knows what has happened. Doc is responsible for the experiment that sends Marty back to 1955. Yet the movie is not really about Doc. It is about Marty. The reason for this is simple. Marty gives the audience a human perspective. Doc already believes in the impossible. Marty does not. Doc has spent years thinking about time travel. Marty has barely a few minutes to understand it. Doc understands a machine. Marty needs to use it. This contrast makes Marty an ideal protagonist. The audience discovers the story through him. Zemeckis also uses Marty's personality to create a specific kind of hero. Marty is not perfect. He is impulsive. He can be sarcastic. He becomes frightened. He makes mistakes. He sometimes reacts before thinking. But he is also loyal, resourceful, courageous, and willing to take responsibility. This combination was important because Zemeckis did not want the protagonist to be a passive observer. Marty actively tries to repair the damage he has caused. One of the greatest strengths of Back to the Future is that its world feels much larger than the story itself. The movie does not need to spend long periods explaining the history of Hill Valley, the rules of American society, or the differences between 1955 and 1985. Instead, it builds its world through locations, objects, architecture, clothing, technology, characters, advertisements, music, cars, social behavior, and small visual details. The result is a world that feels lived in. This is particularly impressive because Back to the Future is not a traditional world-building fantasy. There is no invented planet, no fictional mythology, and no enormous history book explaining the setting. Hill Valley is deliberately ordinary. It resembles an American town that could exist in countless places across the country. That ordinariness is essential. The story works because the audience can imagine that Hill Valley existed before Marty arrived and will continue to exist after he leaves. The town has its own history. People have their own routines. Businesses have their own identities. Families have their own relationships. And the physical environment remains recognizable even as decades pass. This allows the movie to explore one of its central ideas. Places change, but they also retain memories. Marty travels from 1985 to 1955, but he does not travel to an unfamiliar location. He travels to the same town 30 years earlier. That difference is fundamental. If the entire environment changed completely between the two periods, the audience would have difficulty understanding what Marty has changed. Instead, the filmmakers give us two versions of the same community. The audience becomes a visual historian. We see Hill Valley as Marty knows it. Then we see Hill Valley before he was born. And because we understand the future version, every detail in the 1955 version becomes potentially meaningful. The courthouse is particularly important. In 1985, the courthouse is associated with the clock tower and the town's public identity. In 1955, the same location is a much more active part of everyday life. The famous clock tower becomes more than a landmark. It becomes a piece of the town's identity and, eventually, the central mechanism of the movie's climax. The filmmakers use the clock tower as an anchor connecting different moments in history. This is a very effective world-building strategy. Rather than inventing dozens of locations, the movie establishes a small number of important spaces and gives those spaces multiple historical identities. The town square becomes almost like a character. In one period, it looks prosperous and familiar. In another, it looks younger and more old-fashioned. The architecture is recognizable, but the signs, cars, clothing, businesses, and people change. The audience, therefore, learns about time through the environment. This is more effective than simply having a character announce that the movie has traveled 30 years into the past. The audience sees it. The cars are different. The clothes are different. The hairstyles are different. The advertisements are different. The language and social behavior are different. The technology is different. Even the way people occupy public spaces is different. These details make 1955 feel like a functioning society rather than a movie set designed only for the plot. One of the most important world-building choices is that Marty arrives in 1955 before the modern culture he knows has fully developed. He recognizes certain things, but does not recognize the world around them. He knows who people are, but he encounters younger versions of them. He knows what certain locations will become, but he sees them before their future identities exist. This creates a fascinating form of dramatic irony. Marty has knowledge that nobody else possesses, but his knowledge is incomplete. He knows what happened in his version of history, but he does not know all the small events that produced it. That distinction becomes increasingly important. Marty believes he knows his family. He knows George as his father. He knows Lorraine as his mother. He knows Biff as an older bully. But when he enters 1955, he discovers that these people are different. George is shy. Lorraine is outgoing and romantic. Biff is already aggressive and arrogant. Doc Brown is younger and perhaps even more reckless than the version Marty knows. This makes the setting part of the character development. Marty is not simply walking through a historical environment. He is walking through the origins of the people he knows. Hill Valley, therefore, becomes a kind of family archive. Every street contains information about the past. Every building represents continuity. Every person has a history. This is why the town's name itself is useful. Hill Valley sounds like an ordinary American community, but it also has a slightly idealized quality. The filmmakers designed it to feel familiar rather than geographically specific. The audience does not need to know where Hill Valley is. It functions as an archetypal American town. There's a town square. There's a courthouse. There's a high school. There are homes. There are businesses. There's a diner. There are streets designed around automobiles. There are suburban neighborhoods. The town, therefore, represents a recognizable version of American life. This allows the movie to make its themes broadly accessible. Marty's family could almost be any family. George could be any insecure parent. Biff could be any local bully. The high school could be almost any American high school. The setting is specific enough to feel real, but general enough to feel universal. Another major component of the world building is Marty's home. The McFly house tells the audience a great deal about the family before anyone explains it. The house is not presented as a glamorous environment. The family has financial and emotional problems. Marty's parents are not living the life Marty wants for himself. His father is unsuccessful and insecure. His mother is dissatisfied. The family dynamic is strained. The environment communicates this. The house becomes a visual representation of the future Marty fears. This is important because Marty's journey is not simply about returning to 1985. He wants to return to a better version of 1985. At first, however, he does not realize that this is possible. He assumes that his family will always be the way it is. He assumes that his father's personality is fixed. He assumes that his parents' relationship is fixed. Back to the Future is one of those movies that becomes difficult to classify if we try to place it inside only one genre. On the surface, it is a science fiction movie about time travel. But that description leaves out much of what makes the film distinctive. It is also a comedy, a teenage adventure, a family drama, a romantic story, a coming-of-age film, and an action movie. Each genre contributes something different, and the movie's unusual strength comes from the way these genres are combined without allowing any single category to completely dominate the others. The primary genre is science fiction, because the central premise depends on an impossible technological invention that allows people to travel through time. The DeLorean, the flux capacitor, the time circuits, the 88 miles per hour requirement, and the changing timeline all belong to the science fiction tradition. However, the movie does not treat science fiction in the same way as a serious scientific drama. Its approach is playful, accessible, and character-centered. The movie is interested in the consequences of science fiction more than the scientific theory behind it. This distinction is extremely important. A more traditional hard science fiction movie might spend considerable time explaining how time travel works, what physical laws are involved, whether paradoxes are possible, and what theoretical model supports the technology. Back to the Future does almost none of this. Doc Brown gives the audience enough information to understand the rules, but the movie quickly moves toward the consequences. The flux capacitor is introduced because the story needs a mechanism for time travel. The 88 miles per hour requirement is introduced because the story needs a condition that creates suspense. The time circuits are introduced because the audience needs to know where and when Marty is going. The movie does not ask the audience to become physicists. It asks the audience to understand a simple set of dramatic rules. That makes Back to the Future science fiction for a mainstream audience. The science fiction genre provides the impossible premise, but the other genres determine how that premise is experienced. The second major genre is comedy. In fact, comedy is so important that some viewers might describe the film primarily as a science fiction comedy. Almost every major situation contains some form of humor. Marty's confusion in 1955 is funny. Doc's personality is funny. George's insecurity is funny. Lorraine's attraction to Marty is funny. Biff's arrogance is funny. The differences between 1955 and 1985 are funny. The time machine itself creates funny situations. The movie's humor comes from several sources, but one of the most important is contrast. Marty knows something that the people around him do not know. The audience knows something that Marty does not know. Characters from different generations interact without understanding one another. The humor emerges naturally from those differences. This is a classic comedy mechanism. Incompatible perspectives are placed in the same situation. Marty knows that George will eventually become his father, but George does not know who Marty is. Lorraine sees Marty as an attractive teenage boy rather than as her future son. Biff treats Marty as an outsider, while the audience knows that Biff will eventually become a major figure in Marty's family history. Doc initially sees time travel as a scientific breakthrough, while Marty sees it as a potentially disastrous accident. The movie repeatedly creates humor by placing characters inside situations they cannot fully understand. Physical comedy is also important. Zemeckis uses movement, falls, collisions, facial expressions, awkward reactions, and exaggerated behavior. Michael J.Fox's performance is particularly important because he can communicate comedy through reaction. Marty often does not need to say anything. His face tells the audience that he cannot believe what is happening. This makes him an effective comedy protagonist because he becomes the audience's emotional reaction to the absurdity of the story. The film also uses verbal comedy. Characters have distinctive speech patterns. Doc speaks with intense enthusiasm. George often speaks hesitantly. Biff speaks with confidence, even when he is being ridiculous. Marty speaks in a more contemporary, casual style. The contrast between these voices helps create humor. The third major genre is the teenage adventure. Marty is a teenage protagonist, and the movie is deeply connected to the concerns of adolescence. He is worried about his future. He has a girlfriend. He has parents he finds embarrassing. He has a school life. He has dreams about becoming a musician. He wants independence. He is beginning to think about adulthood. These are classic teenage concerns. The time travel premise magnifies them. Instead of simply worrying about whether his parents understand him, Marty meets them when they are teenagers. Instead of wondering what his future will look like, he accidentally threatens his own existence. Instead of worrying about whether he fits into his community, he becomes a complete outsider in another era. The movie, therefore, transforms ordinary adolescent anxiety into an adventure. This is one reason the story has remained accessible to younger audiences. The protagonist is not defined by his scientific knowledge. He is defined by curiosity, frustration, friendship, and uncertainty. He is a teenager who has not figured out his future. That makes the time travel premise emotionally relevant. Another important genre is the family drama. This may seem surprising because the movie is so energetic and comedic, but the relationship between Marty and his parents is central to the story. At the beginning, Marty is dissatisfied with his family. He sees his father as weak. He sees his mother as unhappy. He worries about ending up in the same kind of life. The time travel adventure forces him to confront his assumptions. He discovers that his parents were once teenagers. They had dreams. They had fears. They were capable of making different choices. This is essentially a family drama disguised as science fiction comedy. The story asks a deeply emotional question. What if you could meet your parents before they became your parents? The answer allows Marty to understand them differently. George is no longer simply the embarrassing father. He becomes a frightened teenager who needs confidence. The opening sequence of Back to the Future is one of the clearest examples of efficient cinematic storytelling in mainstream film. Within roughly the first 10 to 15 minutes, the movie establishes its central characters, introduces the tone, creates curiosity, establishes important locations and objects, introduces the central scientific mystery, gives the audience information about Marty's family and ambitions, and prepares the viewer for the extraordinary event that will completely change the story. What makes the opening particularly effective is that it does not begin with an explanation of time travel. Instead, it begins with objects. The first images focus on clocks and machines inside Doc Brown's house. Clocks fill the environment. They are everywhere. This immediately establishes the idea of time before the audience knows why time will become important. The opening is therefore doing something very sophisticated. It introduces the movie's central concept visually before the characters explain it verbally. We are told, through the environment, that this is the home of someone who is obsessed with time. The clocks are not just decoration. They establish Doc's personality. They establish the theme. They create curiosity. And eventually, they become part of the film's larger system of visual clues. The audience is encouraged to ask a simple question. Who owns a house filled with clocks? The answer is Doc Brown. The opening then establishes another important element of the movie's world. Doc is an eccentric scientist. His home is chaotic, filled with inventions, equipment, wires, clocks, and unusual objects. The environment tells us that Doc does not live like an ordinary person. He is completely absorbed in experimentation. This is important because the movie does not need to stop and explain his character history. The production design does that work. Before Doc even appears, the audience already has an impression of him. He is obsessive. He is inventive. He is eccentric. He is fascinated by time. He is probably dangerous in some entertaining way. The opening also introduces the theme of cause and effect. The clocks are connected to one another. One clock eventually becomes especially meaningful because it establishes that Doc has a particular obsession with time. The movie is telling us that details matter. This is a story in which small objects will eventually become important. That expectation is established almost immediately. Then the audience begins to encounter the machinery associated with Doc's experiments. The opening creates a sense of mystery. We do not yet understand exactly what Doc is doing. We see strange equipment. We see inventions. We see scientific activity. The audience is invited to become curious rather than immediately given an explanation. This is a useful storytelling strategy. If the movie had opened with a long speech explaining the time machine, the audience would understand the premise but would not necessarily feel curiosity. Instead, the movie creates questions. What is Doc building? Why is he so obsessed with clocks? What is the purpose of all this equipment? Why is this house so strange? The answers come gradually. This makes the opening feel active even before the main plot begins. The opening then moves toward Marty McFly. Marty is introduced as the audience's point of identification. This is extremely important because the movie could have chosen Doc as its protagonist. After all, Doc is the inventor. He knows about time travel. He has created the machine. He has the scientific knowledge. But the filmmakers choose Marty because he provides a more ordinary perspective. Marty does not understand everything. He is not a scientist. He is a teenager. He is curious about Doc, but he is not obsessed with science. His perspective allows the audience to discover the extraordinary world gradually. When Marty enters Doc's house, the audience can learn about the environment at roughly the same pace that Marty does. This creates a relationship between protagonist and viewer. We are discovering the mystery together. Marty's introduction also immediately establishes his personality. He is energetic. He is confident enough to challenge Doc. He is curious. He is comfortable around strange technology. He is also clearly a teenager of the 1980s. His clothing, hairstyle, skateboard, music, and behavior establish a generation. The movie does not need to announce that Marty is a modern teenager. The environment around him communicates it. This is one of the strongest features of the opening. Nearly every detail is doing more than one job. Marty's skateboard tells us something about his age. His clothes tell us something about the period. His music tells us something about his personality. His interactions with Doc tell us something about their friendship. His attitude toward his family tells us something about his emotional situation. The opening is therefore character exposition disguised as ordinary activity. Marty's relationship with Doc is especially important. The movie wants the audience to understand that these two are friends before the time travel adventure begins. This makes everything that happens later more meaningful. If Doc were simply a scientist Marty had recently met, the emotional stakes would be weaker. Instead, there's an existing relationship. Marty trusts Doc. He is willing to visit him. He is comfortable in his strange house. He interacts with him casually. This tells us that Doc is not simply an eccentric inventor. He is Marty's friend and mentor. That relationship eventually becomes one of the emotional foundations of the movie. The opening also begins establishing the difference between Marty and his family. Marty is ambitious. He wants to become a musician. He wants a life that feels exciting. He does not want to become like his parents. This is one of the central concerns of his character. He is worried about the future. He is worried that his life will resemble the unhappy circumstances he sees at home. That concern may initially seem like ordinary teenage dissatisfaction. But later, when Marty travels to 1955, it becomes central to the story. He discovers the origins of his family. He sees that his parents were once young. He sees that their personalities were not always what he assumed. The opening, therefore, establishes a question that the time travel story will eventually answer. What kind of future will Marty have? This question is present before Marty ever enters the DeLorean. The opening also introduces Marty's relationship with his girlfriend, Jennifer. The central conflict of Back to the Future begins with a simple desire. Marty McFly wants to live his own life and avoid the disappointing future he sees in his family. He wants to succeed as a musician, maintain his relationship with Jennifer, and avoid becoming like his father. At the beginning, these concerns seem ordinary. They're the kinds of problems many teenagers experience. But once Marty becomes trapped in 1955, those ordinary concerns are transformed into a much larger crisis. He is no longer simply worried about his future. He has accidentally placed his own existence in danger. This transformation is the foundation of the film's conflict structure. Marty begins with personal dissatisfaction. He then encounters an external problem. The external problem creates a threat to his existence. That threat forces him to confront his family history. His family history creates additional complications. Those complications lead to a deadline. The deadline creates suspense. And the suspense eventually becomes an action climax. The movie therefore builds its conflict in layers rather than relying on one single antagonist. The first conflict is Marty versus his circumstances. Before the time travel occurs, Marty already feels that his life is moving in the wrong direction. His family is not the kind of family he wants to have. His father is timid and unsuccessful. His mother is unhappy. Biff has power over George. Marty worries that his own future could follow the same pattern. This creates an internal conflict. Marty wants independence, but he is also afraid of becoming trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He wants to believe that his future can be different, but he does not yet know how to make it different. This is important because the time travel plot eventually gives him a literal version of that problem. Instead of simply worrying about the future, Marty discovers that the future can actually change. Instead of wondering whether his parents could have lived different lives, he meets them when they are teenagers. Instead of wondering whether his family history could have been different, he accidentally begins changing it. The science fiction conflict therefore externalizes Marty's internal concerns. The movie's central idea can be summarized through one basic question. Are we trapped by the circumstances that created us, or can our choices change what comes next? Marty's adventure is an attempt to answer that question. The second major conflict is Marty versus time. Once Marty arrives in 1955, he immediately wants to return home. But returning home is not as simple as finding a road or waiting for a machine to repair itself. He needs the DeLorean. He needs enough energy to activate the time travel system. He needs to know when the machine can be used. And he needs to coordinate a very specific event. This turns time itself into an antagonist. Time is not a person. It cannot be defeated. It cannot be reasoned with. It simply continues moving. That makes the conflict particularly effective. Marty is racing against something that cannot stop. The story, therefore, uses one of the oldest sources of suspense in storytelling: the deadline. The audience knows that Marty has a limited opportunity to return to 1985. As the story progresses, that opportunity becomes increasingly specific. The final plan depends on a lightning strike. The lightning will occur at a particular time. The DeLorean has to be moving fast enough. The electrical connection has to be made correctly. Marty has to be in the right place at the right moment. The closer the story gets to the climax, the less room there is for error. This is how the film converts a complicated science fiction premise into simple dramatic stakes. The audience does not need to understand every theoretical aspect of time travel. The audience only needs to understand this. Marty needs to reach the right place at the right time. If he fails, he may never return home. The third major conflict is Marty versus the consequences of his own actions. This is one of the most important aspects of the story because Marty is not simply the victim of an accident. He accidentally changes history. When he encounters his teenage father and mother, he interferes with the event that originally brought them together. This creates a problem that is entirely caused by his presence. Marty, therefore, becomes responsible for fixing a situation he created. This makes the conflict more satisfying. He cannot simply wait for someone else to rescue him. He has to repair the damage. His actions have consequences. This principle is central to the film. Marty learns that the past is not a museum. It is a living environment. If you interfere with it, you can change the future. This is one of the reasons the movie's time travel concept is dramatically effective. The past is dangerous precisely because Marty can influence it. The fourth major conflict is Marty versus Biff. Biff represents a direct physical and social threat. He is aggressive. He is intimidating. He takes advantage of George's weakness. He expects people to obey him. Marty does not accept that authority. This creates an immediate clash. But Biff is important for more than simply being a bully. He represents the possibility of a future dominated by fear and submission. Marty's father has allowed Biff to control him for years. Marty has grown up watching this happen. He dislikes it. He fears it. He does not want to become like his father. Therefore, Biff is connected to Marty's internal conflict. Defeating Biff is not simply about stopping a bully. It is about proving that George does not have to remain powerless. And if George can change, Marty's future can change. This is why the conflict with Biff becomes connected to the larger family story. The fifth major conflict is Marty versus his parents' expectations. This conflict is less obvious but extremely important. Marty initially sees his parents as people who have failed to create the life he wants. But the 1955 storyline changes that perception. He discovers that George is not naturally weak. He is simply inexperienced and afraid. He discovers that Lorraine is not simply the unhappy mother he knows. She is a young woman with her own desires and expectations. Marty, therefore, has to confront the difference between knowing someone and understanding someone. This creates an emotional conflict. He must help his parents become the people he needs them to be. But he cannot simply force them. George has to choose courage. Lorraine has to choose George. Back to the Future does not have a conventional villain in the same way that a traditional action movie does. There is no single character whose entire purpose is to destroy the hero or take over the world. Instead, the film creates several antagonistic forces that work together to make Marty's journey increasingly difficult. The most obvious of these is Biff Tannen. But time itself, the consequences of changing history, Marty's own mistakes, social circumstances, and even the limitations of the time machine all function as opposing forces. This is important because the movie's conflict is fundamentally different from a simple hero versus villain story. Marty is not trying to defeat one evil person. He is trying to restore the correct sequence of events. He is trying to protect his future. He is trying to help his parents. He is trying to return home. And he is trying to prevent his actions from creating consequences that he cannot control. Biff is therefore only one part of a larger antagonistic system. Still, Biff is the most recognizable antagonist in the movie. He is introduced as a bully who uses intimidation to control George McFly and the people around him. His power comes from physical strength, confidence, aggression, and the willingness to exploit people who are less confident than he is. He does not need to be a genius. He does not need a sophisticated plan. He simply knows that George is afraid of him, and he uses that fear. This makes Biff a particularly effective antagonist for the story, because he represents the kind of person Marty fears his father has allowed himself to become a victim of. Marty does not respect Biff. He sees him as arrogant and destructive. More importantly, Marty sees the effect Biff has on George. George's lack of confidence is not presented as an isolated personality trait. It is reinforced by the environment around him. Biff has spent years taking advantage of George's weakness. That relationship is one of the reasons Marty worries about his own future. He sees his father as someone who has never learned to stand up for himself. Marty does not want to inherit that weakness. Therefore, Biff is connected directly to Marty's internal conflict. The antagonist is not simply standing in the hero's way. He represents a future Marty wants to avoid. This makes Biff more important than his comedic behavior might initially suggest. He is funny, but he is also symbolic. He represents intimidation. He represents abuse of power. He represents the social hierarchy that allows confident people to dominate insecure people. And he represents the possibility that fear can become a permanent part of someone's identity. This is why George's confrontation with Biff matters so much. When George finally stands up to him, the moment is more than a victory over a bully. It represents the breaking of a pattern. George has spent years allowing Biff to define his behavior. In 1955, Marty creates circumstances that give George the opportunity to change. But George ultimately has to make the decision himself. This is important because the movie does not suggest that Marty can simply rewrite his father's personality. Marty can influence events. He can encourage George. He can create opportunities. But George must choose courage. The conflict between George and Biff, therefore, becomes one of the film's most important demonstrations of personal agency. Biff's effectiveness as a villain also comes from his simplicity. He does not have a complicated ideology. He does not believe he is saving society. He does not have a grand philosophical goal. He wants control. He wants status. He wants to get what he wants. He expects other people to submit. This simplicity makes him easy to understand. The audience immediately knows what kind of person he is. That clarity is useful in a fast-moving movie. There is no need for a long explanation of Biff's worldview. His behavior explains him. He pushes George around. He insults people. He uses threats. He takes advantage of weakness. He expects obedience. The audience understands him almost immediately. This is especially effective because the movie's main plot is complicated. Time travel can be difficult to follow. The changing timeline can create complex questions. The relationship between Marty and his parents is unusual. The time machine has specific rules. Because of this complexity, the antagonist benefits from being straightforward. Biff creates a simple human problem inside a complicated science fiction story. Marty knows how to deal with Biff because Biff's behavior is understandable. The larger time travel problem is much harder. This contrast helps maintain narrative clarity. Another important antagonistic force is the past itself. Marty arrives in 1955 without intending to change history. But the past is unfamiliar. The people are different. The technology is different. The social expectations are different. The language and cultural references are different. The environment is different. Marty therefore becomes an outsider. This makes the setting itself a form of opposition. The past does not actively attack him, but it resists his attempts to control it. Marty's knowledge of 1985 does not automatically make him powerful in 1955. In some situations, his modern knowledge makes things worse. He knows who his parents are, but they do not know him. He knows how their relationship is supposed to develop, but he has accidentally disrupted it. He knows what the future looks like, but he cannot simply tell everyone because that could create further changes. He knows that certain technologies will eventually exist, but he cannot necessarily access them in 1955. The past therefore creates practical limitations. This is one of the most effective aspects of the film. The time travel premise gives Marty extraordinary knowledge, but the unfamiliar environment prevents that knowledge from solving everything. Another major antagonist is the butterfly effect. The movie does not necessarily use this scientific term explicitly, but the concept is central. A small change in the past can produce a major change in the future. Marty's presence alters events. His actions affect George. His actions affect Lorraine. His actions affect Biff. Those changes eventually affect 1985. The past therefore becomes dangerous because even minor actions can have major consequences. This turns Marty's own behavior into a potential antagonist. Back to the Future can be understood extremely well through the hero's journey, the three-act structure, and the Save the Cat story model. Although the film was not designed simply by following one rigid formula, its narrative naturally contains many of the stages associated with classic adventure storytelling. The structure works because Marty McFly begins in an ordinary world, receives an extraordinary opportunity, crosses into an unfamiliar environment, faces increasingly difficult obstacles, reaches a major crisis, and finally returns home transformed. The important thing to understand is that Marty's journey is both physical and psychological. Physically, he travels from 1985 to 1955 and then back to 1985. Psychologically, he travels from uncertainty about his future toward a greater understanding of personal choice. The time machine, therefore, becomes a literal representation of a character journey. Marty does not simply travel through time. He travels through the history of his own family. He discovers where his parents came from. He sees his father before he became the person Marty knows. He sees his mother before she became his mother. He discovers the circumstances that shaped his family. And through this experience, he begins to understand that the future is not predetermined. This makes Back to the Future a particularly strong example of a coming-of-age story disguised as a science fiction adventure. The hero's journey traditionally begins with the ordinary world. The hero is introduced before the adventure changes everything. In Back to the Future, the ordinary world is 1985. Marty's life is recognizable and relatively ordinary. He attends school. He has a girlfriend. He plays guitar. He spends time with Doc Brown. He lives with his family. He has dreams about the future, but his ordinary world is not completely satisfying. Marty is worried about his family. He is frustrated by his father's lack of confidence. He dislikes Biff's influence. He is concerned about his own ambitions. He wants to become successful. He wants to avoid becoming trapped in the same circumstances. This is important because the hero's journey usually begins with a problem or imbalance in the hero's ordinary world. Marty's world looks normal from the outside, but he already wants something more. He wants possibility. He wants independence. He wants a better future. The audience therefore understands his emotional motivation before the adventure begins. The next stage is often called the call to adventure. The hero encounters something that disrupts ordinary life. For Marty, the call to adventure is connected to Doc's time machine. At first, Marty does not fully understand what is about to happen. He is simply participating in Doc's experiment. But the experiment transforms his life. The DeLorean becomes the gateway into the extraordinary world. This is particularly effective because the call to adventure is not presented as a conscious decision by Marty. He does not wake up one morning and decide that he wants to travel through time. Instead, he becomes involved through his friendship with Doc. This makes the event feel accidental. And the accidental nature of the journey is important to Marty's character. He is not initially a traditional heroic figure. He is a teenager caught in circumstances beyond his control. The hero's journey often includes a refusal of the call. Marty's story does not follow this stage in a completely traditional way. Once he realizes that he is in 1955, he immediately wants to return home. In that sense, his refusal is not refusal to adventure. It is refusal to remain in the extraordinary world. He wants his normal life back. This creates an interesting variation on the classic structure. The ordinary world is suddenly desirable because Marty has lost it. Before the adventure, he was frustrated with 1985. After entering 1955, he realizes how much he wants to return. This reversal is important. It teaches him that ordinary life has value. The world he wanted to escape is also the world he belongs to. This becomes one of the emotional lessons of the story. Another stage of the hero's journey is meeting a mentor. In Back to the Future, this role is complicated because Doc Brown is both mentor and friend. Doc provides Marty with scientific knowledge. He understands the time machine. He understands the mechanics of the situation. He helps Marty understand what has happened. But Doc is not a conventional wise old mentor who knows everything. He is eccentric. He makes mistakes. He is learning too. In fact, Marty possesses knowledge that Doc does not have. Marty knows what happens in the future. Doc knows how the time machine works. They therefore become mutual mentors. Doc gives Marty scientific knowledge. Marty gives Doc information about the future. This is one of the more interesting variations on the hero's journey structure. The mentor is not simply above the hero. The mentor and hero need one another. Their relationship becomes a partnership. Another important element of the hero's journey is crossing the threshold. This is the moment when the hero leaves the familiar world and enters the unfamiliar one. Marty's journey through time is an almost perfect literal representation of this stage. The moment the DeLorean travels from 1985 to 1955, Marty crosses the threshold. He is no longer in his ordinary world. He is now in a world governed by unfamiliar social rules, technology, culture, and circumstances. The crossing is physical, temporal, and psychological. The visual design of 1955 reinforces this. The cars look different. The clothing looks different. The stores look different. The streets look different. The technology is different. The behavior of people is different. Marty suddenly becomes an outsider. This makes the threshold crossing especially powerful. He has not simply entered a different location. He has entered a different historical reality. The next stage of the hero's journey involves tests, allies, and enemies. This is where much of the movie's second act takes place. Marty begins learning how the new world works. He meets his younger parents. He encounters Biff. He finds Doc in 1955. He attempts to understand the situation. He learns what needs to happen for him to return home. He discovers that his own actions have altered history. Each of these experiences becomes a test. The most important test involves his parents. Marty knows that George and Lorraine must eventually fall in love. But because he has arrived in the past, he accidentally changes the circumstances that lead to their relationship. When Back to the Future was released in 1985, computer-generated imagery was still in a relatively early stage of development. Modern audiences are accustomed to seeing digital characters, completely computer-generated environments, digitally simulated destruction, virtual cameras, and effects that can be created almost entirely inside a computer. Back to the Future belongs to a very different period of filmmaking. Its visual effects were created primarily through practical techniques, optical compositing, miniature work, mechanical effects, pyrotechnics, controlled photography, and carefully designed physical props. This is particularly important because the movie is fundamentally about an impossible technological idea. The central object is a car that can travel through time. The filmmakers, therefore, faced a major visual challenge. They had to make the impossible machine feel believable. The audience had to accept that a modified DeLorean could somehow become a time machine. At the same time, the filmmakers did not want the movie to become a dry science fiction experiment. The technology had to feel exciting, strange, humorous, and visually memorable. The solution was to make the technology highly physical. The DeLorean exists as a real object. Doc's laboratory exists as a real environment. The cables, equipment, clocks, tools, and electrical devices are visible. The machine has doors, wheels, wires, circuits, and controls. This physicality gives the fantasy a sense of reality. The audience may not believe that the machine could actually travel through time, but the machine looks as though someone could build it. That distinction is extremely important. The film does not attempt to make the science completely realistic. Instead, it makes the technology visually convincing. This is one of the central principles behind the movie's special effects. The DeLorean is one of the most important visual effects achievements of the film, even though it is not itself a computer-generated object. The filmmakers selected the DeLorean because its appearance already suggested the future. Its gull-wing doors, metallic body, angular shape, and distinctive design made it look unusual compared with ordinary cars of the period. This gave the time machine an immediate visual identity. The vehicle looks like something that belongs to a science fiction story, but it is still recognizable as a real car. That combination is ideal for the film. The audience sees an ordinary object transformed into something extraordinary. This reflects one of the movie's broader ideas. The extraordinary is hidden inside the ordinary. A suburban street can become the location of a time travel experiment. A shopping center parking lot can become a laboratory for an impossible invention. A normal car can become a machine that crosses decades. A high school dance can become the location of a major historical turning point. The special effects therefore support the storytelling philosophy. The movie does not need an entirely invented fantasy world. It transforms familiar objects and locations. One of the most memorable technological concepts in the film is the flux capacitor. The flux capacitor is presented as the key component that makes time travel possible. From a scientific perspective, the device is fictional, but visually, it is designed to look like a piece of experimental equipment. It has a recognizable structure. It is housed inside the vehicle. It is surrounded by wiring and mechanical components. It has a specific visual function. This makes the fictional technology easier for the audience to understand. The audience does not need to know exactly how it works. We simply need to understand that it is important. This is a common principle in effective science fiction design. Fictional technology should have a visual language. The flux capacitor has that language. It becomes one of the defining symbols of the franchise. The time circuits serve a similar purpose. They provide a visual representation of the movie's central concept. Time travel is abstract. We cannot see time itself, but we can see numbers. We can see dates. We can see displays. We can see the characters entering information. This converts an abstract idea into something concrete. The audience can look at the time circuits and immediately understand that the machine is dealing with different points in history. The filmmakers therefore use technology as visual storytelling. They do not simply explain time travel through dialogue. They show it through props, displays, clocks, and physical movement. Clocks are especially important throughout the film. Doc's laboratory is filled with them. This is not accidental. The clocks establish his obsession with time. They also prepare the audience for the movie's central concept before the time machine is fully explained. The opening imagery is therefore doing narrative work. Before the audience understands the science, the environment is already communicating the theme. Time is everywhere. Clocks are everywhere. Machines are everywhere. Doc's entire world is organized around measurement, experimentation, and mechanical invention. This creates a visual bridge between the ordinary world and the extraordinary technology that follows. Another important special effect is the actual time travel sequence. The film does not show Marty entering a glowing portal or disappearing into a digital vortex. Instead, the DeLorean accelerates rapidly and produces a distinctive visual trail. The car seems to cut through space and time. The effect is memorable because it is simple. The audience sees the physical consequence of the car's movement. There is light. There is energy. There is a sudden disappearance. There is a dramatic reaction from the characters. The effect is designed to be instantly recognizable. Once the audience sees it, they understand that the car has traveled through time. The filmmakers also use controlled practical effects to create the impression of enormous energy. The time travel sequences required careful coordination between the vehicle, camera, lighting, pyrotechnic effects, and post-production techniques. This kind of filmmaking required precision because the effect could not simply be generated after the fact. The physical elements had to be captured correctly. The result is that the time travel sequence has a tactile quality. We can feel the speed. We can see the light. We can see the environment reacting. This gives the sequence energy. The emotional impact of Back to the Future comes from an unusual combination of comedy, science fiction, family drama, romance, suspense, and adventure. On the surface, the movie is energetic and entertaining. It contains jokes, exaggerated characters, strange inventions, teenagers, fast cars, and an impossible journey through time. Underneath that entertainment, however, the film is built around several deeply understandable emotional fears. Marty is afraid of becoming like his father. He is afraid of losing his future. He is afraid of being separated from home. He is afraid that his family is trapped in circumstances they cannot escape. And once he arrives in 1955, he develops an unexpected emotional connection with the younger versions of the people he thought he already understood. This combination of spectacle and personal emotion is one of the main reasons the film has remained so powerful. The audience is not emotionally invested in time travel simply because time travel is interesting. The audience is invested because Marty has something to lose. He has a home. He has parents. He has a girlfriend. He has a future. He has dreams. And all of these things become uncertain. The emotional structure begins before Marty ever enters the DeLorean. His ordinary life already contains disappointment. His family is not presented as an idealized suburban family. George is timid. Lorraine is unhappy with aspects of her life. Biff is controlling. Marty worries about his own future. This gives the audience an emotional reason to care about what happens. If Marty were completely satisfied with his life, the time travel adventure would primarily be a fantasy. Because he is already worried about his future, the time travel adventure becomes personal. Marty is essentially given the opportunity to see the origins of the life he fears. That creates an emotional contradiction. He wants to escape his family's problems. Then he discovers that he may be responsible for preventing his family from existing in the first place. This creates one of the film's most effective emotional reversals. At the beginning, Marty sees his family from the outside. He sees the results. He sees George as a weak father. He sees Lorraine as an unhappy mother. He sees Biff as an oppressive figure. He sees the family as something already established. When he travels to 1955, those people become individuals. George is a teenager. Lorraine is a teenager. Biff is a young bully. None of them has reached the future Marty knows. This changes the way Marty sees them, and it changes the way the audience sees them. One of the most emotionally significant developments is Marty's changing relationship with George. At the beginning, Marty is frustrated by his father. He sees George as someone who does not stand up for himself. He is embarrassed by George's weakness. He fears that the same weakness might shape his own life. But in 1955, Marty discovers that George is not simply a hopeless person. He is a frightened young man. He has dreams. He writes stories. He wants to be successful. He wants to approach Lorraine, but he lacks confidence. This creates empathy. Marty begins to understand that his father's adult personality was not inevitable. George had possibilities. Fear limited him. Biff reinforced that fear. Circumstances reinforced it. Marty therefore begins to see his father differently. This is one of the most important emotional transformations in the movie. Marty does not simply save his father for Biff. He begins to understand him. The emotional impact of this storyline comes from recognition. Many people can relate to discovering that their parents were once young. Children often think of parents primarily as parents. It can be difficult to imagine that they once had dreams, fears, ambitions, embarrassing moments, friendships, and romantic problems of their own. Back to the Future turns that universal experience into a literal time travel adventure. Marty meets his parents as teenagers. He is forced to see them as people. That gives the movie an emotional foundation beneath the comedy. The relationship between Marty and Lorraine creates a different emotional effect. At first, it is played for comedy. Lorraine becomes fascinated by Marty because she does not know that he is her future son. Marty is horrified by the situation. The audience understands the irony. We know the truth. Lorraine does not. This creates comedic tension. But beneath the comedy is something more complicated. Marty is forced to protect his own future while interacting with a version of his mother who has no idea who he is. He has to maintain a distance while also influencing her choices. He cannot simply tell her everything. He has to make sure she falls in love with George. This gives their scenes a strange, emotional quality. Marty is trying to help the woman who will eventually become his mother, but she does not recognize him. The situation is absurd, but it is also strangely intimate. Marty sees a version of his mother that he has never known. He learns about her personality before adulthood. He discovers her hopes. He discovers her romantic expectations. And he realizes that the person he knows as his mother had an entire life before him. This contributes to the movie's emotional theme of family understanding. Another emotional high point comes from the gradual transformation of George. Marty initially believes George needs to be rescued, but the movie eventually shows that George needs to make his own decision. When George confronts Biff, the emotional significance is enormous. The audience has watched George avoid confrontation. We have seen Biff intimidate him. We have understood the pattern. Therefore, when George finally stands up for himself, the moment feels like a genuine breakthrough. The action is satisfying because it resolves more than a physical conflict. George is not simply stopping Biff. He is rejecting the identity that Biff has forced upon him. He is proving to himself that he is capable of courage. And because the audience knows that George's courage will influence Marty's future, the moment has two emotional meanings. It saves George, and it saves Marty. This is one of the strongest examples of the film connecting character development to plot. The emotional reward is not separate from the science fiction story. It is the science fiction story. Another major emotional element is Marty's fear of disappearing. Back to the Future is an unusual case when it comes to adaptation because the film was not based on a previously published novel, comic book, television series, or other established fictional property. It was an original screenplay created specifically for the screen. There is therefore no conventional source text to compare with the finished movie. This fact is extremely important to understanding the film's development. Back to the Future did not begin as a story that filmmakers were trying to transfer from one medium into another. Instead, the movie developed through an original idea about time travel, family history, adolescence, and the possibility of meeting one's parents when they were young. Because there was no source novel dictating the characters, plot, setting, or themes, the filmmakers had unusual freedom. They could change the story repeatedly during development. They could experiment with the tone. They could alter the time machine. They could rewrite the protagonist. They could reconsider the supporting characters. They could change the rules of time travel. They could adjust the comedy. They could make the story more accessible. This freedom was one of the film's greatest creative advantages. At the same time, it also created significant development challenges. An original science fiction comedy does not come with an existing audience. The filmmakers could not assume that viewers already understood the concept. There was no famous novel to provide credibility. There was no established franchise to guarantee recognition. The story had to explain itself. The audience had to understand who Marty was, who Doc was, what the time machine did, why the trip to 1955 mattered, and what could happen if history changed. The filmmakers, therefore, had to build the entire mythology from scratch. The origins of the movie are closely associated with the creative partnership between Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale. The two writers were interested in the idea of time travel, but they wanted to approach it differently from many conventional science fiction stories. Instead of making the central character a scientist, military officer, astronaut, or adult explorer, they centered the story on a teenager. This choice was extremely important. A teenager naturally provides a bridge between generations. Marty can belong to the modern world while still being young enough to experience his parents' teenage years as something completely alien. The central question behind the concept became especially powerful because of that relationship. What would happen if a teenager could go back in time and meet his parents when they were teenagers themselves? The idea immediately created opportunities for comedy. Marty would know his parents as adults. He would know their personalities. He would know their relationship. But he would suddenly encounter them before they became those people. That creates an unusual combination of science fiction and family comedy. The concept also creates a built-in emotional problem. If Marty interferes with his parents' relationship, he could erase himself from existence. This gave the writers a practical narrative problem to build the entire story around. Marty is not simply visiting the past. He is accidentally interfering with the events that created him. This turns the time travel concept into a story about identity. Who are we if our parents had made different choices? How much of our lives is determined by circumstances? Can a person change the future? Can one decision alter an entire family? These questions were embedded in the original premise. The movie, therefore, did not need an existing source material to give it depth. The premise itself contained the central themes. One of the most interesting aspects of the screenplay's development is the evolution of the time machine. The finished movie is inseparable from the DeLorean, but the concept did not always exist in that form. During the development process, the filmmakers considered different possibilities for the machine. One early concept involved a refrigerator. The idea was that the time machine could be contained inside a household appliance. This would have emphasized the film's comic science fiction approach. The problem was that the refrigerator was not as visually dynamic as a car. A car could move. It could be driven. It could participate in chase sequences. It could travel through streets. It could become part of the action. The DeLorean eventually provided a much more cinematic solution. It transformed time travel from a static scientific event into a physical adventure. The protagonist could drive the machine. The machine could be pursued. It could be hidden. It could be damaged. It could run out of power. It could be placed on a road. It could be connected to a lightning strike. This gave the story more opportunities for action. The decision to use a car, therefore, changed the nature of the movie. The time machine became an active part of the plot. It was not simply a device that transported characters. It became a vehicle for suspense. The development of the machine also influenced the film's visual identity. The DeLorean was already distinctive. Its metallic appearance and gull-wing doors made it look futuristic. The filmmakers could modify it with cables, equipment, lights, and other components to create the impression that it had been transformed into an experimental invention. This helped bridge the gap between science fiction and comedy. The machine looked serious enough to belong in a science fiction story, while still being strange enough to fit Doc Brown's personality. The character of Doc Brown also developed through the writing process. The final version is eccentric, energetic, brilliant, and unpredictable. He is an unconventional scientist who has spent years pursuing an idea that other people might consider impossible. This makes him an ideal mentor for Marty. But Doc is also a comic character. His exaggerated behavior prevents the science fiction elements from becoming too serious. He can explain complicated concepts while simultaneously behaving like an eccentric inventor. His personality gives the movie permission to be playful. The relationship between Doc and Marty is another original creation that became central to the film. Marty is not related to Doc. They are not teacher and student in a conventional sense. They are friends. This is important because it makes the time travel adventure emotionally accessible. One of the great pleasures of Back to the Future is that the movie rewards careful viewing. The main story is easy to understand on a first viewing, but the filmmakers filled the movie with visual clues, repeated images, jokes, references, foreshadowing, and connections between different periods of time. Many of these details are not necessary to understand the plot. Instead, they make the fictional world feel more carefully constructed. This is particularly appropriate for a movie about time. The film constantly asks the audience to notice connections between different moments. Something seen in 1985 can have a different meaning when seen again in 1955. A location can change. A character can change. A sign can change. A family can change. An object can move from one period to another. Even a small detail can become important later. This means that the movie itself behaves almost like a time machine. Information introduced early can return later with a new meaning. One of the most obvious examples is the clock tower. Early in the movie, the clock tower is connected to Hill Valley's history. The clock is a familiar landmark. By the climax, however, it becomes the center of the time travel plan. The clock tower is therefore transformed from background scenery into a critical piece of technology. The audience has already seen it. We know where it is. We understand that it exists. When Doc later proposes using the lightning strike, the location feels familiar. This is an important storytelling technique. The filmmakers do not introduce a completely new location for the climax. They return to something the audience has already seen. The result is stronger because the location has already become part of the visual geography of Hill Valley. The clock itself is also thematically appropriate. Back to the Future is a movie about time, and the town's most prominent landmark is a clock. The movie therefore places its central theme directly into the environment. The clock is not simply decoration. It becomes a symbol of the story. Time is constantly being measured. Marty has limited time. Doc has calculated a precise moment. The storm must happen at a specific time. The DeLorean must reach the correct location. The entire climax depends on synchronization. The clock represents the idea that time is both an abstract concept and a physical measurement. Another major hidden detail appears in Doc Brown's laboratory. The room is filled with clocks. This immediately tells us something about Doc. Before he explains his invention, we already understand that he is obsessed with time. The audience might initially see the clocks as eccentric decoration. Later, their meaning becomes obvious. Doc has devoted himself to understanding time. The clocks therefore function as visual foreshadowing. The movie does not need to tell us that Doc has been thinking about time for years. His laboratory demonstrates it. This is an example of environmental storytelling. The set itself contains information about the character. Another clever detail is the way the opening sequence connects the clocks to Doc's personality. The laboratory appears chaotic. Machines and equipment occupy the space. Clocks are everywhere. The environment suggests that Doc's mind works differently from an ordinary person's. He is surrounded by inventions. He is constantly experimenting. He does not organize his life according to conventional expectations. This makes the later revelation that he has invented a time machine feel more believable. The audience has already been prepared for something extraordinary. Another recurring visual idea is the use of signs and storefronts to establish time. When Marty visits 1955, the town looks different. The architecture is familiar, but the details have changed. Signs, vehicles, advertisements, clothing, and businesses create historical differences. This is important because the filmmakers want the audience to feel that Marty has traveled backward without requiring constant verbal explanations. The environment tells us. One of the most effective hidden details is that locations can remain recognizable even when their identities change. The town square exists in both periods. The courthouse exists. The school exists. The streets exist, but their surrounding details change. This gives the audience a visual comparison. We are effectively looking at the same place at two different points in history. That makes the time travel concept more tangible. Another recurring object is the DeLorean itself. The vehicle is visually distinctive enough that the audience can recognize it immediately. But its role changes as the story progresses. At first, it is Doc's strange invention. Then it becomes Marty's way into the past. Then it becomes the only way home. Finally, it becomes the centerpiece of a lightning plan. The car, therefore, acquires different meanings. It begins as an object of curiosity. It becomes a source of danger. Then it becomes a source of hope. This transformation mirrors Marty's journey. Another interesting detail is the connection between the DeLorean and its required speed. The movie repeatedly associates the vehicle with speed. The audience learns that it must reach the necessary threshold to travel through time. This means that acceleration becomes part of the mythology of the machine. The filmmakers reinforce this through sound and editing. The car's engine becomes associated with anticipation. When the DeLorean accelerates, the audience understands that something extraordinary is about to happen. This becomes one of the movie's most recognizable visual and sonic patterns. Another subtle detail is the way the film uses photographs to represent history. The photograph of Marty and his siblings is more than a prop. It is a visual representation of his existence. As history changes, the image changes. This gives the audience a direct way of observing an invisible process. Time travel normally creates an abstract question. What happens to the future if the past changes? The photograph provides a simple answer. The future begins disappearing from the image. The characters can see history changing. This is one of the cleverest narrative devices in the movie because it makes the consequences immediate. Another detail is that Marty's disappearance from the photograph occurs gradually. The effect creates suspense because the audience can see the deadline approaching. Marty is not instantly erased. There's a process. That process allows the audience to worry. The photograph becomes a countdown. Back to the Future was not simply a creative success. It was an extraordinary commercial success, and its financial performance is an important part of understanding why the movie became such a major cultural phenomenon. The film began as an original science fiction comedy with no established franchise behind it, yet it eventually became one of the defining box office successes of the 1980s. That achievement is particularly impressive when we consider the circumstances surrounding its production. The movie had an estimated production budget of approximately $19 million. That was a substantial investment for an original film, particularly one built around an unusual combination of science fiction, comedy, teenage adventure, romance, and family drama. The studio was therefore taking a meaningful financial risk. There was no existing best-selling novel guaranteeing an audience, no established cinematic series, and no recognizable superhero character at the center of the story. The commercial success of the film demonstrated that audiences were willing to embrace an original concept when it was presented in an accessible way. The movie was released in the United States on July 3rd, 1985, just before the Independence Day holiday period. This was an advantageous release window because summer audiences were already strongly oriented toward major entertainment releases. However, Release timing alone cannot explain what happened next. The film opened strongly and then displayed unusually durable box office performance. According to box office tracking data, the film eventually earned roughly $222.5 million domestically and approximately $170.5 million internationally across its releases, producing a worldwide total of roughly $393 million in the currently tracked theatrical figures. Other industry databases report slightly different totals, depending on how re-releases and international markets are counted, with some estimates placing the overall worldwide theatrical total close to $400 million. The precise number can therefore vary depending on the accounting method. The broader conclusion, however, is not in doubt. Back to the Future was a massive theatrical success. Its financial performance was especially impressive when compared with its production cost. A production budget of around $19 million against a worldwide theatrical gross approaching $400 million represents an enormous multiple of the original production investment. Box office revenue is not the same thing as studio profit, because theaters keep a portion of ticket sales and additional expenses such as marketing, distribution, interest, and residuals must be considered. Nevertheless, the difference between the production cost and theatrical revenue demonstrates why the movie became such an important commercial asset for Universal. The movie's opening was already strong. Box office tracking records an opening of approximately $11.15 million, with the film playing in roughly 1,400 theaters. What makes the performance particularly interesting is that the movie did not behave like a film that depended entirely on a massive opening weekend. Instead, it demonstrated exceptional staying power. Audiences continued going to see it. This is sometimes described as having strong legs. A film with strong legs does not simply explode during its opening and then disappear from theaters. It continues attracting audiences week after week. Back to the Future benefited enormously from this kind of sustained interest. The film became one of those movies that people recommended to friends and family. That created a cycle. People heard positive reactions. They want to see it. They enjoyed it. They recommended it to someone else. New audiences then went to see it. This kind of word of mouth can be extremely valuable for a movie with a broad demographic appeal. Back to the Future was particularly well positioned for this. Teenagers could identify with Marty. Families could appreciate the comedy. Adults could respond to the nostalgia and family themes. Science fiction fans could enjoy the time travel concept. Romance audiences could appreciate the George and Lorraine storyline. Adventure audiences could enjoy the chase sequences and climactic race against time. The film therefore had multiple entry points. This is one of the major reasons its financial performance was so strong. The movie was not dependent on one narrow audience. It could be marketed as a science fiction film. It could be marketed as a comedy. It could be marketed as a teenage adventure. It could be marketed as a family movie. And all of those descriptions were accurate. This flexibility is extremely valuable in commercial filmmaking. A movie that appeals to several demographics has more opportunities to generate repeat and cross-generational attendance. Another important factor was Michael J. Fox. At the time, Fox was already known to television audiences through Family Ties. His popularity gave the film an additional commercial advantage. Audiences already had a relationship with him. This was particularly important because Back to the Future was introducing an original character rather than relying on a famous franchise. Marty McFly was not an established character before the movie. Michael J. Fox helped make the character instantly accessible. His youthful energy and comic timing also became central to the movie's appeal. The casting, therefore, had both artistic and commercial consequences. The film's music also contributed to its commercial identity. The soundtrack became strongly associated with the movie. The use of popular music helped make the film feel contemporary while its story traveled into the past. The song The Power of Love by Huey Lewis and the News became closely associated with the film and was a major commercial success. This created a useful relationship between the movie and popular music culture. The soundtrack helped the film remain present outside theaters. Radio exposure could remind people of the movie. Music videos could reinforce the movie's identity. The audience could encounter elements of the film through other forms of popular entertainment. This kind of cross-promotion can strengthen a movie's cultural presence. Another major commercial strength was the film's rating and broad accessibility. Back to the Future was released with a PG rating that made it accessible to a large audience. Parents could take younger viewers. Teenagers could attend. Adults could enjoy it without feeling that it was specifically designed for children. The fandom surrounding Back to the Future is one of the clearest signs that the movie became much more than a successful theatrical release. Many films are remembered fondly for a few years, perhaps even a decade, before their audiences gradually become smaller. Back to the Future followed a different path. Its audience continued to grow across generations, and the movie eventually became part of a worldwide fan culture built around the characters, the DeLorean, time travel, the music, the locations, the humor, and the mythology of the series. What makes the fandom especially interesting is that it does not depend entirely on nostalgia. Nostalgia is certainly an important part of the appeal. People who watched the movie during the 1980s may associate it with their childhood or teenage years. They may remember seeing it in theaters, renting on home video, watching it on television, or discussing it with friends at school. But younger viewers who discover the movie decades later can become equally enthusiastic. This creates something important for a long-running franchise. The original generation supplies memories. Later generations supply discovery. The two groups meet around the same movie. Back to the Future, therefore, became a form of cultural inheritance. Parents introduce it to children. Older fans recommend it to younger fans. People who grew up with the movie continue discussing it with people who were not born when it was released. This intergenerational relationship has helped the fandom remain active for decades. One reason the fan community is so strong is that the movie provides an unusually large number of things to become interested in. Some fans focus primarily on the characters. They love Marty McFly and Doc Brown. Others are fascinated by the time travel mechanics. Some are interested in the DeLorean. Others collect memorabilia. Some fans enjoy the historical details of the 1955 setting. Others focus on the music. Some are interested in filmmaking and production history. Others enjoy finding continuity details and Easter eggs. This means the fandom is not built around one single type of interest. It is an ecosystem. The movie can be appreciated as science fiction. It can be appreciated as comedy. It can be appreciated as a period piece. It can be appreciated as a coming-of-age story. It can be appreciated as a piece of 1980s popular culture. It can be appreciated as an example of screenwriting and storytelling. And it can simply be appreciated as an entertaining adventure. This variety gives the fan community room to grow. The DeLorean is perhaps the most visible symbol of this fandom. The car became one of the most recognizable vehicles in movie history. Even people who have never watched the entire film often recognize the general image of a stainless steel DeLorean with distinctive modifications. For dedicated fans, however, the car becomes much more than an image. Fans build replicas. They restore actual DeLoreans. They attend events with the vehicles. They photograph them. They display them. They discuss the differences between versions. They analyze the equipment mounted on the car. They debate which details are most accurate. The DeLorean has therefore become a physical object through which fans can participate in the fictional world. This is especially powerful because the original movie treats the car as a character-like object. The audience learns how it works. They learn what it needs. They learn its limitations. They see it destroyed and repaired. They see it travel through different periods. The car becomes emotionally associated with Marty and Doc. For fans, owning or displaying a DeLorean can therefore feel like owning a piece of the story. Fan conventions have played an important role in maintaining this culture. Actors and filmmakers connected with the movie have appeared at conventions and fan events over the years. These events allow audiences to meet performers, obtain autographs, take photographs, purchase collectibles, and participate in conversations about the franchise. Conventions also create a social environment. A person who loves Back to the Future may be the only major fan among their immediate friends. At a convention, However, they can suddenly be surrounded by thousands of people who understand the same references. This is one of the fundamental functions of fandom. It turns individual enthusiasm into shared identity. Someone wearing a Back to the Future shirt at an ordinary shopping center may simply be wearing a piece of movie merchandise. Someone wearing the same shirt at a fan convention is making a statement of belonging. The fandom becomes a community. Costuming and cosplay are another important part of that community. Marty's outfit is particularly recognizable. The red vest, denim clothing, sneakers, and casual teenage appearance create an instantly identifiable costume. Doc's appearance is even more visually distinctive. His wild hair, laboratory clothing, and eccentric scientific image make him easy to recognize. Fans can reproduce these looks without needing extremely complicated costumes. The characters, therefore, lend themselves naturally to cosplay. The DeLorean can also become part of cosplay and convention photography. Fans can pose beside replicas. They can recreate scenes. They can reproduce promotional images. They can imitate the characters. These activities allow people to transform passive fandom into performance. The movie's fandom also became increasingly visible through the internet. Before the internet became a major part of everyday life, fans depended on magazines, newsletters, conventions, fan clubs, television programming, and personal correspondence to communicate. The internet changed that. Fans could suddenly discuss the movie with people anywhere in the world. Websites could collect production information. Discussion boards could analyze scenes. Fans could compare theories. Photographs of memorabilia could be shared. Rare information could circulate. Later, social media made this process even faster. Today, fans can encounter Back to the Future content on platforms such as YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Reddit, and other social networks. Short clips can introduce the movie to people who have never seen it. Memes can keep its jokes alive. Back to the Future is one of the clearest examples of a movie whose reputation has remained remarkably stable while its meaning has continued to evolve. When a film was released in 1985, audiences primarily experienced it as an exciting, funny, imaginative summer blockbuster. It was a contemporary movie about a teenager, a strange scientist, a time machine, and the possibility of changing history. More than 40 years later, audiences approach the same film from a completely different historical position. The world that once represented the present has become the past. The future imagined by the sequels has itself become history, and the original movie has transformed from a contemporary entertainment product into a major piece of cinematic heritage. This change in perspective has not significantly weakened the film's reputation. If anything, it has strengthened it. Back to the Future is now widely regarded as one of the defining popular films of the 1980s and one of the most successful examples of mainstream science fiction storytelling. Its reputation has survived changing tastes, changing technology, changing filmmaking styles, and changing audience expectations. That is important because popular cinema is constantly being reassessed. Some movies that were enormous successes when they were released become less admired as decades pass. Other movies are initially misunderstood and only later receive greater appreciation. Some disappear almost completely from public discussion. Back to the Future has followed a different path. It has remained commercially recognizable, critically respected, and deeply embedded in popular culture. One of the most important reasons is that the film's central premise has aged exceptionally well. Time travel is not tied to one particular technology. The story does not require audiences to believe that a specific real-world device exists. Instead, the movie uses time travel as a storytelling mechanism. The DeLorean provides the visual identity, but the emotional core is about family, identity, adolescence, and the relationship between the past and the future. Those themes do not become obsolete. A teenager trying to understand his parents is still understandable. A young person worrying about the future is still understandable. A person wishing they could change something about their life is still understandable. The fear of making a mistake that affects the future is still understandable. And the desire to return home after an unexpected journey is one of the oldest storytelling ideas imaginable. Because the emotional structure remains relevant, the movie has been able to survive technological change. The movie's original technological imagery has obviously become dated. The computers shown in 1985 are primitive by modern standards. The communication devices are outdated. The visual representation of futuristic technology in the wider franchise can look quaint. The 1955 world is obviously historical. The 1985 world is now historical as well. Yet these elements do not necessarily damage the film. In some cases, they make it more interesting. Modern viewers can see the movie as a time capsule. The audience is effectively looking at three different historical periods at once. There is the real 1985, in which the movie was produced. There is the fictional 1955 represented in the story. And there is the imagined future represented in the sequel. The original film therefore occupies a fascinating position in time. When viewers watch it today, they are watching a movie from the past that was itself about traveling into the past. That creates a kind of accidental meta-commentary. The movie's relationship with time has become more complicated simply because time has passed. In 1985, the story asked audiences to imagine what would happen if someone from the present traveled 30 years into the past. Today, audiences can look back 30 years from 1985 and understand exactly what the filmmakers were imagining. The film's 1985 world is no longer contemporary. This changes the meaning of certain scenes. Marty's teenage life is now historical. The technology around him is historical. The cars are historical. The music is historical. The clothes are historical. The social attitudes are historical. This does not prevent modern viewers from relating to him. Instead, it creates another layer of nostalgia. The film originally used 1955 as a nostalgic setting while presenting 1985 as the present. Modern audiences can now feel nostalgia for the 1985 sections as well. This is one of the most remarkable transformations in the movie's reception. The film has effectively become the historical period that it originally represented as the present. That makes Back to the Future unusual among blockbuster films. Its fictional structure has continued to age with the audience. Another reason the movie's reputation remains strong is its screenplay. The story is remarkably efficient. The movie establishes a clear problem. Marty travels into the past. He accidentally interferes with his parents' relationship. His own existence becomes threatened. He must repair the damage. At the same time, he must find a way to generate enough electrical energy to return to 1985. These problems become connected. The emotional conflict and the physical conflict are not separate. Marty must solve the family problem in order to restore the future, while also solving the time travel problem in order to return home. This creates a strong cause-and-effect structure. Modern audiences are accustomed to complicated blockbuster storytelling. Many contemporary franchises involve multiple characters, multiple locations, parallel plot lines, extensive mythology, and long-form storytelling. Back to the Future is comparatively simple. There are relatively few central characters. The main story takes place in one town. The time period changes, but the geographical setting remains connected to Hill Valley. The goal is clear. The deadline is clear. The consequences are clear. This simplicity has become one of the film's strengths. It makes the movie easy to follow while still allowing complexity. The film demonstrates that a high-concept story does not need to be complicated to be intelligent. The time travel mechanics create complexity naturally. The emotional story keeps that complexity understandable. The movie also benefits from extremely strong character chemistry. Michael J.Fox and Christopher Lloyd created a partnership that remains one of the most recognizable actor pairings in popular cinema.